Alrighty, howdy everybody. Good afternoon. Wanted to comment on it. I would say would have to be the most significant development of this week, which is that Rush Limbaugh died on Wednesday at the age of 70. Is that right? And it's significant because I think it's pretty hard to dispute that Rush Limbaugh, for better or worse, was maybe the single most of the U.S. media and cultural landscape in the past 25, 30 years. And it's hard to foresee how such an influence like that could be replicated because he had almost a monopolistic grip on one particular medium for a long time. Now, there were legions of imitators that he spawned, so maybe monopoly is overstating it, but he dominated the talk radio medium to such an extent that it all ended up kind of revolving around him. He was the flagship, personality in that field. And rather than get into the whole litany of controversial statements that he made over the years and the different kinds of shtick that he employed to make his points, which is what his antagonists in the media have generally focused on, I think it's a little bit more fruitful to kind of step back and assess his place in the broader landscape. And so to do that, you sort of, I would think, have to begin by analyzing why it is that he was able to develop such a large audience in the first place. Well, it's pretty clear that he ascertained correctly that there was a gaping void in that media landscape. And that void could be seized upon and then commercialized to great success. I mean, he ended up earning staggering amounts. Wanted to, evidently there were a lot of people who yearned for or who craved, even if they didn't exactly know it or could articulate it, they craved some kind of news analysis that was at that point what you might call counter hegemonic. So the corporate media at the time, which was different in composition than it is now, but nonetheless, they had a general ethos. And you could argue that it was leftward or liberal. But I think that when he started, late 80s, early 90s, the kind of liberal orientation of the media then was almost this default kind of corporatized thing. Whereas now it's a little bit more overtly activist in orientation. So there has been a change in terms of how you would characterize that hegemonic status quo. But nonetheless, there's always going to be an appetite for something counter hegemonic. And he filled that void. And he did it in an entertaining style. Obviously, if you're on AM radio, you have a built-in audience back then of people who don't have a whole lot of entertainment options, and just switch on the dial and then you're listening to right-wing talk radio if you're not interested, say, in religious talk or music, obviously, or sports. Not a whole lot of options. And I can speak from experience, just as somebody who, before you could listen to basically anything you wanted at any time, anywhere, I would find myself regularly listening to But it was hugely influential because, again, this is anecdotal, but I think you could probably broaden it out to be in accordance with a lot of people's experiences growing up, like in, say, in the early 2000s. Almost everybody I personally met who self-identified as like an overt, proud conservative, they attributed their conservatism to listening to Rush Limbaugh, or at least that was their starting point. So he probably was personally responsible for the political developments of an untold number of people. Now, his audience, his influence probably diminished somewhat over the years because the kind of monopolistic hold that he had in the 90s was never going to be sustainable as technology advanced and there were more venues for people to get similar kind of content out there. But after he had that market share, it had clearly a long-lasting impact. So the point that I make in this Unheard article that you could read, it's linked in the description box as always, is that the counter-hegemonic appetite that he was responding to and that he was catering to and that he was making a lot of money in feeding, that it doesn't stand to reason that such an appetite ought to intrinsically lend itself to the kind of hyper-partisan rancor that he specialized in. Because he funneled or channels that anti-hegemonic sentiment into this kind of stalwart support for one of these, for whatever the status quo in the Republican Party was at any given time. And that meant he didn't have really the fixed principles that you often see people attributing to him. The fixed principle was that he was a supporter of the Republican Party, which is, fine, if that's what you are, but you shouldn't mistake it for some kind of intensely organized ideological worldview. And what's an example of that? Well, when people after his death have been commenting on the relationship he had with Trump. It is true that Trump did, honor him at the State of the Union address in 2020, gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, etc. Trump, had these what was called a virtual rally with him in October, where he called in and just ranted for 2 hours. But if you go back into the archive, his support for George W. Bush, his rousing defenses of George W. Bush and the Iraq War were just as, if not more, vigorous than his later defenses of Trump were. And that's because at core, he was commercializing partisan support for one political party. He's not alone in that. I mean, you have examples of liberals doing that as well. But he was definitely the headliner in fulfilling that kind of function for the Republicans. And the tragic element of it is that the counter-hegemonic impulse that was latent in the populace at the time that he came out to the scene has justified reasons for being aggrieved or alienated from the mainstream liberal consensus. But then he kind of takes it and then funnel it into just, it's like, he was feted by both Bushes constantly. He, he was called by Newt Gingrich to be the single most, or called by the Gingrich Revolution stalwarts in 1994 to be the single most consequential person in ushering the Republicans into power into the Congress. George H.W. Bush invited him to the White House, where he slept in the Lincoln bedroom, and then Bush personally carried his bags for him. George W. Bush, as he was leaving office, invited him for a private luncheon at the White House, where Bush presented him with a chocolate microphone. So And then, if you're like me, and every time you would tune in the early 2000s when you're kind of formulating your initial political identity, every time you tuned into Rush Limbaugh, he was ranting in favor of the Iraq War and, demonizing every opponent of the Iraq War as a liberal America hating squish. Then you could understand why you'd have doubts that he was just, this principled person who could then support the entirety of the Trump agenda without reservation. Because, Trump got on a debate stage in the 2016 Republican primaries and accused George W. Bush of lying the country into war. And that's exactly the kind of rhetoric that Rush, 10 years before, would have lambasted for probably 3 days straight as just this zany, liberal, anti-American hysteria. But Limbaugh was able to make that transition so seamlessly from Bush to Trump because the fixed principle wasn't anything particularly ideological. It was being a partisan figurehead for one party. And so in the future, because the media landscape is much more diffuse, but aren't quite as inclined to then marshal that into this unflinching support for one of the two main parties. And now Rush, I'll have people say, "Oh, but Rush, he didn't like the Republican establishment." Well, I mean, that's always how Republicans frame their support for the party. Nobody likes the quote establishment, or at least they don't admit it. But they always end up basically manufacturing consensus for that establishment in one way or another. And that's more or less what he did. And in the aftermath of his death, a lot of the obituaries are just this kind of laundry list of, oh, he said this in 2012, he said this in 1993, whatever. And it doesn't give you a whole lot of insight at the function he had in the political system. And so that's what I tried to do in this piece. So give it a read if you so please. Had a connectivity problem, so I'm not getting chats at the moment, unfortunately. So if you're trying to chat right now, I apologize. But I'll do it again soon, and I'll get the connectivity issues hopefully resolved. I've tried to troubleshoot them, and I still get issues. So we'll see. All right, talk to you later.